Chapter 5. Bertha's new tires made it perfect for off-road driving, and that was what was needed as Sam and Joe made their way closer to the city. They'd driven all night, maneuvering around areas of gridlocked traffic and wandering pedestrians. The sight of a working vehicle had startled many, and entire groups of people had tried to flag them down. But Sam wasn't going to stop. He couldn't, not when there was so much at stake. "Do not stop for anything," Joe told him as they passed by another group of people in an open field who desperately tried to chase after their vehicle. The closer they got to the city, the more people they seemed to find. "I know," Sam said back to his friend, as though this were the most obvious thing in the world. "I know you know," Joe said with a shrug. "I just want to make sure you know, Can you pull out a road map and guide me through your thought processes, please?" Sam said with a sigh. "That's uncharted territory, brother man," Joe replied with a laugh, while Bertha went airborne for a brief moment as they cleared a small hill. "Hot damn, this thing can move. You've been busy." "She's a classic," Sam said, nodding in agreement. "I just needed to make her a little more functional." "Functional?" Joe scoffed as they moved back into a stretch of open road. "If Uncle Sam knew you had something like this, you'd be shipped off to Gitmo." "Now you see why I don't show it off to people," Sam replied. "Oh, shit." Ahead of them stood a line of people, all banded together to try to stop their advance. "Bastards must have heard us coming," Joe said. "This old girl might be functional, but she's a noisy bitch, ain't she?" "Her one flaw," Sam said, "but power ain't quiet." "Amen to that," Joe replied. The people gathered along the highway waved their hands at the oncoming vehicle. It looked as though they were crouched over a figure on the ground. "Looks like someone's hurt," Sam said, slowing down just a bit. "Don't you dare fall for that, Samuel Shields," Joe said, crossing his arms and shaking his head. "You floor this boat right the fuck now." "What if that person's really hurt?" Sam asked, pointing ahead. "Do not stop," Joe repeated. "I'm not going to stop," Sam said defensively. "But maybe we should move off-road." "You do that and we'll be swarming with these cocksuckers," Joe replied. "I've seen enough of these ambushes back in Iraq. Floor it." "But floor it," Joe insisted. Sam obliged with a sigh, pushing on the accelerator and speeding their tank-like vehicle along the highway. As the rev of the engine roared, the person on the ground sprang up and ran for cover, along with all the other people blocking the road. From the sides of the highway, a group of a dozen men appeared, firing assault rifles at the car, which bounced off the shielding like hailstones in the winter. "Holy shit!" Sam exclaimed, as they moved past the attempted hijacking and onto the open road. "Told ya," Joe said smugly, placing his hands behind his head as they barreled toward their destination. "All right, big man, that's a point for you," Sam said. They continued for another hour, moving off-road when the need arose and avoiding crowds of people as best they could. They never encountered another attempted ambush, and Sam had learned a valuable lesson about trust in that moment. As they drove, the air around them started to become clouded, and Sam started to fear the worst. "The fuck is all this?" Joe asked, sitting up in the passenger seat to look out over the clouded roadway. "Fog?" "Smoke," Sam said, the words spilling out of his mouth like a curse. "We're close to the city." "Shit," Joe exclaimed sadly, shaking his head. "Already, huh? I gave these people too much credit." "I didn't," Sam replied, his voice tight as he continued toward the bridge that would carry them to their destination. As they neared the bridge, the number of cars they had to maneuver around was rapidly multiplying, with off-road options at a minimum. "I think we need to stash the truck," Sam said to Joe. "We walk the rest of the way." "Yeah, I was about to say the same," Joe responded, sounding as though he were dreading this leg of the journey. They hid the car in some dense foliage, locking it up tight. No one would be able to break through the glass or armored plating, so Sam was confident it would still be waiting for them when they returned. The off-road tires were secured using locking lug nuts, so he didn't even have to worry about someone trying to strip the car for parts. They unloaded their gear from the truck's bed, where it had been covered by netting to prevent it from spilling out as they went off-road. Joe grabbed the weapons bag and slung it over his broad shoulders. The two of them also strapped their disaster kit to their backs and holstered as many weapons as they could on their waists and legs. This included guns, knives, and ammunition to spare. "Let's move out," Sam said. "Aye, aye," Joe said, checking his assault rifle's ammunition, as the two of them headed off through the smog toward the bridge. As they approached the massive structure that stretched out over the water for almost an entire mile, they got their first clear view of the city's skyline. "Mother of God," Sam muttered, his mouth hanging open, as the two of them saw the city of Manhattan spewing smoke into the skyline like a 1920s factory. "Holy hell," Joe responded, as he took in the state of the city the two of them had once called home. There was smoke pouring out of buildings all over the island. Whoever had set off the EMP had likely coordinated an attack to coincide. It made sense to Sam. Taking away the power would be a heavy psychological blow. The population would be confused and scattered as phones and vehicles died. Then at the height of their panic, several hours later, a coordinated assault on landmarks begins. That would drive the already frazzled population into a blind panic, setting them against one another in a frantic struggle for survival. It would become barbaric and chaotic, as the need to live on shattered societal norms, creating violence in the streets. The police and military would be overrun, facing down not only the terrorists who enacted this horrible plot, but also the very civilians they swore to protect. And of course, the criminal element of the city would take full advantage of this situation. There would be looting, riots, murders, and stampedes of people trampling one another. It was a matter of days before the city fell to complete anarchy. They needed to get to Carolyn and Eric before that happened. "I'm sure they're all right," Joe said, understandably assuming that Sam's mind was stuck on the safety of his wife and child. "I appreciate the sentiment, friend," Sam said, with a melancholy shake of his head. "But you don't know that any more than I do." "You're right, I don't," he said. "But I know that wife of yours. She's a mama wolf if there ever was one, and I don't think they've made the breed of terrorists who can harm your kid with her around." Sam laughed at the comment. It was true that Carolyn was a fiercely protective mother. It was why, rather than allow Eric to dorm at the school, she'd chosen to move there with him for the duration of the school year. "She's been that way since that boy was a baby," Sam remarked. "I used to tease her about being a helicopter mom, but now I'm glad for it." "Damn right," Joe said. "That boy's in good hands, and you don't have to worry about Carolyn. That woman knows how to fight, she knows how to shoot, and she knows how to take care of people. She's going to make it to the apartment with Eric, and they're both going to be in one piece." "I sure as hell hope so," Sam said with a shake of the head. "Don't give me any of that hope bullshit," Joe said, stepping forward as he started to cross onto the bridge. He looked back over his shoulder and called out to his friend, "You tell me that you know damn well." Sam smiled, but didn't move to cross the bridge yet. He watched Joe start to move and bent his left knee ever so slightly to test it out. It felt strong beneath him, but Sam knew well how volatile this particular injury could be. He knew he'd crawled to his wife and son over scores of bodies and broken glass if he had to. He'd ensure they escaped unharmed. He just hoped he'd be there at the end of the road to live out the rest of his days with them. He hoped for this, but deep down inside, he doubted it. "I know damn well," Sam called out, before putting his injured leg forward and marching onto the bridge. The first explosions proved to only be a prelude to the true horror. Additional bursts and bangs sounded all around them, and Carolyn soon realized this went beyond a simple isolated incident. The first explosion had been justified in her mind as an accident, but now, as the ground beneath her quickening feet shook and cracked and bursts of superheated wind and dust smashed against her from all angles, she started to see this for what it truly was, a coordinated attack. Whoever had set off the EMP had likely done so in order to facilitate this very moment. The bombs being used could have been moved into place overnight, using the chaos of the blackout to cover whatever preparations needed to take place. The EMP was simply a means to an end. This end specifically. Carolyn chastised herself for not realizing it sooner. She'd been so concerned with the state of the powerless city and getting Eric to safety that she hadn't given much thought, if any, to who could have done this and what they were trying to accomplish. Since the September 11 terrorist attack, New York had become incredibly secure, with counterterrorism measures put in place that had kept the city and its people safe for more than 2 decades. Sam's work with the counterterrorism task force of the NYPD had provided Carolyn with much peace of mind. She knew a lot about the measures the city had taken to keep its residents safe. The thing about those measures, though, was that they all had one thing in common: electricity. Disabling each individual measure would be too tall of an order, but to knock out the power completely would leave the city vulnerable to attack. That terrifying reality was playing out before Carolyn's eyes right here and now. She kept a tight grip on her weapon with one hand, holding it out in front of her as a warning to anyone who might approach. Her other hand continued to hold Eric's wrist with a white-knuckled grip that the jaws of life could never hope to break. She pulled him along, and he offered little resistance, but his movements lacked any kind of enthusiasm or purpose. He was simply letting go, allowing himself to be ragdolled through the streets independent of his own thoughts. He was in shock. The poor boy had heard for his entire life that dangers like this existed in the world. He'd been trained in standard first aid, hand-to-hand combat, and safe firearm care and use. But actually facing those things head-on was a shock to his system that rendered him stupefied. Of course, Carolyn had never personally faced such threats, but she had lived through life as the wife of one of the most marked men in the NYPD. Her husband had fought against domestic terror threats before going on to take on the drug cartels that ran their poison through the streets. She lived through death threats, bounties, and dangerous scenarios that threatened the lives of their family. But this was the first practical test of the skills Sam had instilled in her, and she hoped she was making him proud through her actions. The sound of far-off gunfire filled her ears and seemed to light a fire of panic under those who rushed through the streets around her. In their blind frenzy, many terrified residents slammed into her despite her ominous weapon. Whenever it seemed as though the clouds of dust surrounding them were starting to dissipate, new bursts would sweep through the streets, moving with the intensity of displaced wind to send her hair flying, nearly pushing Carolyn off her feet. "Mom!" Eric called out from behind, as she blindly led him in the direction she believed they needed to go. "Mom, I need to stop." "We can't stop now, baby," Carolyn called back to him, determined to continue moving until they found relative safety. But was anywhere truly safe from this nameless, faceless foe that assaulted the city she called home? "But Mom," Eric called out, starting to pull back on her grip. I don't." He was panicking now, his desperate, frenzied mind looking for something, anything it could wrap around to escape this horrible reality. Without stopping, Carolyn called back over her shoulder. "Eric, I need you to be strong right now," she said. "I need you to—" Before she could finish her sentence, a huge, fiery explosion ripped through the smoke and dust. Erupting from an out-of-sight building nearby The concussive force of the blast took both Eric and Carolyn completely off their feet. Their momentum was abruptly stopped by the broad side of a disabled car. They slammed into it hard, back first. Carolyn collapsed to the street, trying to draw breath back into her lungs. She looked beside her at Eric, who also struggled and held his ribs. Carolyn rolled over her son, her body aching as she groaned and coughed in an attempt to draw in air. She finally managed to fill her lungs, but she felt no relief in the moment. Instead, she was consumed with worry and horror in seeing her son, her little boy, her young man, writhing on the ground in pain from an event that she had been powerless to stop. "Eric," she called out, laying a hand on his shoulder. He didn't respond verbally, but she could hear him coughing. His blonde hair was red with blood, and she started to check his scalp for signs of a wound. She found a small cut on the back of his head, likely created when they had smashed into the truck. She hoped the blow hadn't been too serious, and feared her son might be suffering from a concussion. Those thoughts seemed almost confirmed as Eric retched and vomited onto the pavement. He coughed, sputtered, and emptied the little contents of his stomach onto the ground, and Carolyn could do little more than pat him on the back with concern. She could hear the sound of gunfire through the ringing in her ears that persisted. It was then that she realized her hands were empty. In the wake of the explosion and the impact that followed, she'd dropped her gun. Carolyn scanned the area around her, the screams of groans of the wounded now finding her ears as her eyes darted along the ground. She set her son down gently and tried to stand, but a sudden wave of dizziness kept her on the ground. So instead, she crawled on all fours, scanning through the clouds of dust and smoke with her eyes and feeling along the ground with her hands. Without that weapon, their journey would become far more dangerous. That gun was the only thing that kept them from becoming potential victims of the madness that continued to unfold around them. As she moved away from Eric's writhing body, she could vaguely make out a shining glint through the smoke. She crawled toward it fast and was relieved to see her handgun sitting there as though it were waiting for her. As she reached out for it, she was horrified to see another hand move through the smoke in the direction of her weapon. Carolyn lunged for the gun, her palm slapping down on it and her fingers closing around the handle. The other hand, larger and thicker than hers, fell over her knuckles. A scruffy man's dark face came into view, eyes wide with terror and concern as his fingers attempted to dig between Carolyn's palm and the weapon. But Carolyn was faster than him and jerked her arm back, pulling the weapon free as she settled into a seated position. She instantly brought the weapon up, training the stranger in her sights. She glared with flared nostrils at this person who had tried to take off with her precious lifeline, and mentally prepared to pull the trigger. "Wait! Don't shoot!" he screamed, tossing his arms up to shield his face while purposely moving his body slightly to the right. "Please, get the hell out of here and I won't have to." Carolyn snarled over the sounds of carnage still erupting around them. "I can't," the man screamed, a look of desperation in his eyes as he lowered his arms and spread them out, as if shielding something behind him from Carolyn's wrath. "Please, my wife, she's hurt. I don't know what to do." Carolyn craned her head to see around the man and caught sight of a figure splayed out on the ground. She was cowering, covering her head and face with both arms. One of her legs was extended at a sharp angle, and even from this distance, Carolyn could tell she was hurt badly. She looked again at the man in front of her. She instantly remembered how he'd jumped back when she had taken possession of the gun. He didn't try to flee or even fight back. He simply adjusted his position, putting himself between Carolyn and his injured wife. She quickly realized what she must have looked like to this couple. For them, she was the horrifying enemy envisioned around every corner. The thought of it turned her stomach. Carolyn lowered her pistol and shook her head, sadly. "How bad is she?" she asked the man. He looked at her with confusion before finding his voice. "Her leg is broken. It's really bad," he said. "When the explosion started, we tried to make a break for it. We own the convenience store just down there." He pointed with one hand down the street. "But we barely made it 2 blocks before." He gestured around them at the chaos and destruction. Carolyn nodded in understanding. "I'm a registered nurse," she said, her guilt at having nearly gunned down this couple overriding her common sense. But her motives weren't completely selfless. "If we can get your wife and my son to shelter in your store, I can treat her leg as best I can." The man's face lit up, and he turned back to his wife, who looked up at him with a grimace of pain and the slightest touch of relief and hope. "Please," the man practically spat, as he reached out to her. "Our store's just down there." "1 second," Carolyn said, clearing her head enough to crawl toward Eric, who was still writhing on the ground, holding his torso. "Baby, I'm here. Can you hear me?" she said to him. She was relieved to see his head turn up to her and his eyes focus on her face. "We're going to move into a store over there with some people, but I need you to walk on your own. Can you do that?" Carolyn asked him. Her boy didn't answer. He just stared at her open-mouthed, his hand still clutching at his midsection. "Eric, I need you to focus," she said, and sighed as he slowly nodded. "Can you stand? We need to get out of here." He nodded again, and Carolyn reached over to press her hand against his back. "Come on, let's go," she said gently, right by his ear to be heard over the bedlam. Another series of explosions sounded in the distance, and Eric's fearful attention turned toward the sound, his mouth agape and trembling. "Baby, focus," Carolyn repeated, reaching over with one hand to gently lay her fingers on the far side of his chin and slowly draw his attention back to her. "I need you to focus on me, all right?" Once more, she watched as his shocked eyes focused on her face. "There's an injured lady, and we need to help move her. Can you do that?" The irony of the moment was not lost on Carolyn. She had berated her son just recently for trying to stop and help others, and now here she was, completely reversing her stance. She wanted to believe that Eric's example had somehow shifted her perspective on the matter. But the truth of it was that the couple was offering them shelter, and that was something they desperately needed right now. Besides, a convenience store was likely to have supplies and food they could use to continue their journey toward the apartment. Eric nodded to her once more, and Carolyn helped him climb to his feet. "1 foot in front of the other," she said to him. And within a few steps, Eric was walking unassisted. "Please hurry," the man from before called out to them, and the sound of the man's voice seemed to wake Eric up even more. Carolyn and Eric approached and looked down at the man and his wife. The woman was squirming in agony on the ground, tears leaving streaks down her dirt-streaked face. Carolyn nearly grimaced at the sight of her leg. It was twisted unnaturally, and a white, blood-caked bone had sliced its way through her flesh. It was only due to her years of ER experience as a nurse that she was able to keep her composure. "Jesus," Eric breathed beside her, taking a step back. Carolyn reached out and grabbed him by the wrist, giving it a hard squeeze to keep him focused on the task at hand. The last thing this woman needed was someone else's panic. "All right," Carolyn said, raising her voice to be heard over the bedlam unfolding around them. "We're going to need to work together to move her. Is everyone ready?" The husband and her son both nodded to her, and Carolyn knelt beside the woman, running a comforting hand over her forehead and making strong eye contact with her. "You're going to be fine, ma'am," she said, "but the moving process is going to hurt. I'm going to do whatever I can to help keep that to a minimum, but I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that?" The woman's eyes focused on Carolyn's reassuring face, and she nodded, while biting her lip in preparation. "Perfect," Carolyn said. She turned back toward the husband and Eric. "All right, we need to lift her while keeping her leg braced." The three of them worked together over several minutes to lift the unfortunate woman off the ground. She assigned Eric to keep her legs stable. He hadn't said anything still, and Carolyn hoped that assigning him this crucial task would help his mind snap out of the shock of this horrible atrocity. The woman screamed as she was lifted and moved, which Carolyn had expected, but she seemed to be trying to control her cries of pain. After 5 minutes of painful, agonizing struggle, they reached the glass door of the convenience store. It had been shattered, though whether by the explosions or looters, Carolyn didn't know. They crossed through the doorframe and moved the woman into the center of the store. It was a small shop, filled with food and beverages of all kinds. It looked as though no looters had come through yet. But Carolyn knew it was just a matter of time. The dust and debris from the explosions were wafting in through the door and broken windows, filling the store with a haze that made it look like some kind of twisted nightmare. The imagery was normal, but also not at the same time. "All right, keep her steady," Carolyn instructed, opening Eric's backpack and rooting around for her first aid kit. The husband vanished for a moment and returned with bottles of rubbing alcohol and gauze he'd grabbed off the store shelves. Both Eric and the woman's husband placed their hands on her shoulders and torso, keeping her steady as Carolyn got to work. The woman's screams echoed through the store as Carolyn expertly applied her craft. But without any drugs for pain management, the poor woman was forced to endure the full brutality of the procedure. It took her nearly an hour of work. But by the end of it, Carolyn had managed to set the bone and fashion a makeshift splint out of some wood from a nearby product display and twine. "All right," she said to the woman. "You're all right." Her face was still contorted in pain, and the woman had no strength to thank her. But the husband made up for that silence in droves. "Thank you," he exclaimed, taking Carolyn by the shoulders in a sign of thanks and respect. "1,000 times thank you. Anything in my store is yours for the taking. Please, help yourself to whatever you need, and stay here for as long as you'd like." She'd been thankful for the man's generosity and gratitude. Stepping back into the role of a trauma nurse had felt natural, and Carolyn felt a sense of profound pride in what she'd done. But all of that was overridden by the anxiety that ate at her stomach lining due to the state of her son. "Hey," she said, walking over to him nearly an hour after the woman's wound had been set. Eric was standing near one of the windows, crouched low and staring out into the haze. The sound of distant explosions and gunshots could still be heard in the distance, and Carolyn was just relieved that it seemed to be getting farther away. Eric's face turned to her, his eyes no longer wide with shock. Instead, they were sad and moist, glistening with tears. "How could anyone do this, Ma?" he asked her, shaking his head in sad disbelief. "How could people be so cruel? And what's it all for?" Carolyn sighed. There were no easy answers to such a question. "Those aren't questions I have answers for, kiddo," she said with a weary sigh. "And honestly, we may never know who did this or why. But that doesn't really matter right now. All that matters is that it's happening, and we need to do our best to hold it together and survive long enough to get home." "The apartment is close, at least," he said with hope in his voice. "That's not home, love," she replied sadly. "We need to get to the apartment and wait. Your daddy is coming. I know he is, and once he gets here, then we'll actually go home." "Home," Eric said reflectively, looking out over the devastation of the war-torn city. "That word has never sounded better." Carolyn smiled at him, reaching out to gently caress his cheek with her thumb. As she touched her boy, she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She held in a grunt and managed to keep her face blank, but something wasn't right. She was starting to feel woozy without the adrenaline that had kept her moving throughout the ordeal. She managed a reassuring smile and reached out to give his shoulder a comforting squeeze. Remarkably, Carolyn was able to keep her fingers from shaking. She let go of Eric and walked to the other side of the store, passing by the couple whose names she hadn't bothered to learn yet. The husband was still sitting above his wife, looking down at her with concern. Neither of them paid Carolyn the slightest mind. She crossed to the far wall, pretending to look at some of the food sitting on the shelves. Once she was sure she was out of sight, she gingerly lifted her shirt and glanced down at her stomach. A small piece of shrapnel was sticking out of her abdomen, and blood was starting to flow out from around it. Seeing the wound only intensified the pain. Carolyn gritted her teeth and squeezed her eyes shut. The apartment was only another 10 or so blocks away. She could make it. She could get Eric there safely. Then she'd worry about herself. Her finger lightly traced over the invasive object piercing her flesh. It sent waves of fresh pain coursing through her body, all the way up to her brain, which ached from the agony. She'd need to leave the shrapnel in for now. If she pulled it out, the blood loss would be instantly problematic. She had nothing here to stitch the wound together with, having exhausted nearly all of her first aid supplies on the woman's leg. She needed to tough it out for 10 more blocks. Just 10 more. Then she'd be able to worry about herself. But that couldn't happen until she knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that her son was safe. Chapter 7. The sounds of explosions and gunfire greeted Sam as he and Joe crossed over the bridge and waded into the fray. "Jesus," Joe said, with a solemn shake of his head, as they looked around at the decimation of the surrounding area. "Nightmare stuff," Sam replied, echoing Joe's tone. He remembered his days on the NYPD counter-terrorism task force. This had been their nightmare scenario, the image they painted of a city in ruin that they had worked hard to fight against every single day. But now, more than 20 years later, here he stood in a city of ruins. The smoke and dust that filled the air limited their visibility, but Sam could see the blown-out shells of towering buildings, and the debris rained down on the street before him. Cars were crushed beneath an avalanche of stone and glass, while bloodied, splattered bodies littered the pavement. The area seemed deserted, but Sam knew there could be dangers lurking around every corner. "Some of these people were killed by gunfire," Joe said, stepping over the body of a woman riddled with bullets. "That means we've got ground warfare on top of the bombings." "It might not be the terrorists responsible for all this," Sam said. "The bombing, sure. That's likely the work of whoever masterminded this whole thing. But the more personal, ground-based assault could just as likely be opportunistic civilians and panicking New Yorkers trying to defend themselves." "What a nightmare," Joe responded with a shake of his head. "In the service, you get used to seeing shit like this overseas, but you never expect it to happen in a place that looks and feels so familiar." "I get that," Sam said, walking forward through the smoke. "Just keep on your toes. We're visibly armed, which should be enough to keep anyone normal from trying to fuck with us. But there's nothing normal about this situation." "Right," Joe responded. "Anyone and everyone is dangerous." "That's right," Sam replied. They fell silent after this exchange, moving out with AK-47s pointed ahead to take out any and all threats that might arise. For a long while, there was nothing, and Sam started to wonder if luck was on their side. Perhaps the devastating attack on the city had forced many indoors, taking shelter against the danger and keeping off the street. But the sound of gunfire in the distance told him that was simply wishful thinking. Whenever they heard gunfire drawing closer, Sam or Joe would alter their course. They were prepared for combat, but they weren't foolish enough to seek it out if it could be avoided. "I don't want to be the guy who says it's a little too quiet," Joe said. "But don't you think it's been a little too quiet?" "I was just thinking that," Sam replied. "Maybe it's just our lucky day." "Freeze!" a commanding voice called out from behind them, and Sam winced at his momentary optimism. You gotta be kidding me," Joe said with a shake of his head. "Weapons on the ground," the voice called out again. Sam weighed his options in the moment of silence that followed the command. He had no idea how many people were standing behind him, and whether they were even armed. "What do you want to do?" Joe asked, and Sam bit his lip in concentration. "Final warning," the man behind them said. "Weapons on the ground, hands on your head and turn around slowly by order of the NYPD. Sam's eyebrows went up instantly, and a confident smile flashed across his face. "I'm NYPD retired," Sam shouted over his shoulder. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England," a different voice said. "Captain Sam Shields of the 104th Precinct," he said. "Narcotics." "Holy shit," the first man said. His voice hushed as he paused. "Cap, is that you?" Without the commanding tone stained with threats, Sam instantly recognized the man who had initially stopped them. "Charlie?" he asked, hoping against hope that this was exactly who he thought it might be. He took a chance and slowly turned around, his eyes widening as he saw the familiar face of his one-time protege behind that transparent face shield of his riot helmet, gun drawn, and flanked by 8 other officers in full tactical gear. "Shit, stand down," Charlie said, lowering his gun and signaling his men to do the same. They relaxed instantly and stood straight up, some looking at one another in confusion. "This man is definitely not our enemy." Joe turned as well to face the officers, though he still glared at them in suspicion. Sam walked forward to meet with Charlie, grasping the younger man by the arms. Charlie's dark-skinned face was a little older, with more lines around the eyes than Sam had remembered. But there was no mistaking the passion and vitality in those brown eyes. That was something that never changed with age. "Cap, I can't believe you're here," Charlie exclaimed. "It's damn good to see you, Sergeant," he said with a smile. "Oh, it's Lieutenant now," he replied with a sheepish grin. "You've been gone a long time, old man. You think my career just stopped moving up without you?" "I never doubted you for a second," Sam said with a laugh. "Maybe half a second, though." Charlie chuckled in response. "Sorry about the theatrics there," he said. "We saw 2 heavily armed civilians walking through the street, and things right now are beyond crazy." "No offense taken, LT," Sam replied, nodding back to the men who followed his former friend and protege. "I would have done the same thing in your position." "Well, that's a relief to hear," Charlie replied with a sigh. "But what the hell are you and your friend doing here?" Sam looked back at Joe, who hadn't softened his stance in the least. He cut an imposing figure standing there like a statue, vast and unmovable. As he eyed down the officers from behind a dark pair of sunglasses. "Carolyn and Eric are here," Sam replied, turning back to Charlie with a look of dread and determination. "I came to get them and get the hell out of here before all hell breaks loose." "You're a little late," Charlie said, looking around at the dust clouds and devastation that had descended over the once tall and proud metropolis. "So it would seem," Sam replied with a slow nod. "What's been happening?" "We have no idea, Cap," Charlie said with a shake of his head. "Power went out, and while we were scrambling, all of these bombs started lighting off one after the other." "Any idea who's responsible?" Sam asked, though he knew the likely answer already. "None," Charlie responded. "Not that it matters much right now. All that matters is that we try to keep as many people safe as possible, but we're outmanned and outgunned." "By who?" Sam asked. "Just about everyone," Charlie said. "We don't know who lit this fuse, but just about every bottom feeder in this city is coming out of the woodwork to capitalize on it. We're talking street gangs, biker gangs, the mob, and even some of your old friends." The cartel," Sam said, the words flying out of his mouth like a spit-laced curse. "They've been the worst," Charlie responded. "Their push was pretty immediate. They're openly gunning us down in the street and trying to claim as much territory as possible." "Shit," Sam responded, looking down at the ground as he tried to consider the implications of this. "The cartel?" he heard Joe say, as the huge man came up behind him and laid a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You think that scumbag is still running things?" "He definitely is," Sam replied, his voice quaking with the strain of his anger and disgust. "Guys like that don't just pack it up and go home until they're in the dirt." "You talking about Julio Roja?" Charlie asked, looking past Sam at Joe. "The son of a bitch who shot my friend in the knee?" Joe responded rhetorically. Yeah, he's still pulling all the strings," Charlie said with a grim nod. "Him and his uncle." "Don Eduardo is still alive?" Sam asked, his eyebrows raised in surprise. "That man was ancient when I first moved over to narcotics." "He's too much of a mean old fuck to ever die without a bullet to the skull," Charlie lamented. "But Julio is still running things, and I'm sure he hasn't forgotten you, Cap." "Well, when you stab a man in the eye, they have a hard time forgetting your name, I guess," Sam said with a shrug. "Most badass thing you ever did," Joe said with a chuckle of remembrance. "Maybe so," Charlie said. "But if he finds out you're on the streets, he's going to throw everything he's got at you." "Then he better not find out," Sam replied grimly, knowing full well that Julio Roja still carried a massive grudge against him. To be fair, that grudge went both ways. His feud with Roja was long and bloody. The cartel boss had put bounties on Sam's head in the past and attempted to take him and his top lieutenants out whenever possible. In their last encounter, Sam had taken the drug lord's eye with a shard of glass, and Roja had returned the favor by shooting Sam in the knee and forcing his retirement from the force. Stepping off the job had been a difficult pill for the former top cop in the drug game to swallow, seeing as how he was leaving Roja on the streets to continue preying upon the people of New York. But this EMP and the subsequent attack had seemingly created an all-new opportunity for Julio. It gave him the ability to operate in broad daylight, sending his foot soldiers out into the streets. Sam knew enough of how Roja operated to know he'd be attempting to establish territory and shake down the locals for protection. "Where are you headed, Cap?" Charlie asked. Sam then relayed the details of their plan to Charlie, including where they were headed to meet up with Carolyn and Eric. Charlie's eyes went wide as Sam mentioned the address. "What's wrong?" Sam asked, a knot forming in his stomach. "Shit, Cap," Charlie said, looking at the ground. "That's in the heart of the cartel's seized territory." Sam cursed, kicking at a small rock on the street in frustration. That was possibly the worst news he could have received. If Carolyn and Eric were where they needed to meet up with him, they'd be smack dab in the middle of the most violent and extreme force the city had ever known. And on top of that, it was the one group in all of New York that had a long-running hatred and grudge against Sam. Julio would delight in the death of Sam's wife and son. He'd revel in the opportunity and bask in the ultimate victory. Roja would make it loud and public, so there would be no way for Sam to miss the news. And Julio would be backed by an army of devout followers who looked at his organization like some kind of twisted family. The only hope Sam and Joe had to complete this mission successfully would be to sneak in and out of the enemy's territory, getting Carolyn and Eric to safety before Roja had any idea they were even there. "What do you want to do?" Joe asked, having overheard the exchange and knowing full well the extreme danger they'd need to dive into. "Nothing's changed," Sam said grimly. "We go in, we get my family, and we get out." "Good," Joe said, approving of the plan with a slow nod. "We're with you, Cap," Charlie said. "And if we regroup back at the precinct, I'm sure we can back you up on your way in." "I don't want to put your people in harm's way," Sam said to Charlie. "We need to clean that area out anyway," Charlie said. "Roja's men have dug themselves in deep, and we need to root them out before they spread." Sam considered this for a moment. While it might be easier to get in and out subtly, his wasn't the only family who would suffer under the cartel. If he came in backed by the might of the NYPD, there'd be a lot more action, but they might be able to drive off the cartel, saving hundreds of people in the process. "All right," Sam said. "Sounds like a..." Before he could finish his sentence, he was drowned out by the sound of gunfire. Decades of training had honed his reflexes, and Sam's body was moving before his brain had time to acknowledge the danger. Both Sam and Joe jumped behind a nearby disabled vehicle as shots rang out all through the street. "Charlie," Sam called out, looking up just in time to see his protégé still standing out in the open as dozens of bullets pelted into his body. "No!" Charlie's body seemed to hit the ground in slow motion. Sam watched in horror, his scream of anguish almost louder than the bursts of gunfire that ate through flesh, muscle, and bone. "Get down!" Joe cried out, grabbing his friend by the shirt and yanking him to the pavement. "Are you insane?" "Fuck!" Sam hissed through clenched teeth as tears pushed through his eyelids. "Charlie!" "Process it later," Joe called out over the noise. "Right now, we need to stay alive." Sam nodded, knowing full well that Joe was right, as usual. He had the ability to turn off his remorse, compassion, and grief, to focus entirely on the task at hand. It was the mark of an excellent soldier. But Sam wasn't a soldier. He was an officer, a mentor, a friend, a husband, and a father. He couldn't just stop being all of those things in the heat of battle. But that had never been a problem for him before. He'd seen friends die many times in raids gone wrong, and he'd always managed to feel those emotions and channel them into action. This one, however, hit him hard. "Shit, there's a lot of them," Joe said, scanning the surrounding area. "They're coming out of the woodwork, almost 24 by the looks of it." Sam peeked out as well, watching as Charlie's officers attempted to fight back and were cut down like wheat in the field. Even their riot gear wasn't enough to save them from the awesome firepower these attackers were packing. The attackers were wearing gas masks, but there were no uniforms. They were dressed in baggy street clothes, and many wore red bandanas around their heads or necks. "Cartel," he spat to Joe. His friend looked over at him with some concern and nodded in understanding. Sam slipped out his rifle and held it with such intensity it almost felt as though he could crack the casing. They were focusing their fire on the uniformed officers, and it seemed as though Sam and Joe had gone completely unnoticed. That would work to their advantage. Sam popped up, his rage guiding him as he took careful aim and unloaded on the cartel gunmen. Many of them dropped immediately. Joe popped out from the other side of the vehicle a moment later, mowing down more cartel members, as the group suddenly shifted their sights onto this new threat. The two of them took cover as the sound of bullets slamming into the car they hid behind filled their ears. The vehicle's windows all exploded as bullets smashed through them, whizzing overhead as the cartel showered them with death. Sam reloaded his weapon and kept low. He lay sideways on the ground and popped out by the hood of the vehicle, firing the moment he saw movement. The cartel members were surprised at first, watching their comrades fall around them. They scrambled for safety and searched in panic for the source of this attack. Joe popped around from the other side and took advantage of the distraction, seizing the opportunity to shoot down several more. Sam scooted back into cover, and Joe ducked beside him to reload. The cartel took advantage of this lull and advanced, firing on their position to keep them pinned and avoid another attack. Sam was able to peek out to see them stopping near a large van. They'd thinned the herd to just a little over 10 gunmen, but they were still outnumbered. Then an idea sparked to life in Sam's mind. "Grenade!" he called out to Joe, who instantly looked around, ready to dive for cover. "No, I mean give me a grenade," Sam corrected. Joe grunted and reached along his belt to unclip one of the small handheld explosives. "You better know how to use that, officer," he called out over the sound of gunfire. "Watch and learn, soldier," Sam said, pulling the pin out of the grenade and popping up to heave it at the van the cartel members were crowded around. The grenade sailed through the air, over the heads of several gunmen, and rolled to a stop just underneath the van, just as Sam had planned. The explosion tore through the underside of the van, ripping into the fuel tank and igniting whatever gasoline and oil had remained in the vehicle at the time of the EMP. The van exploded in a massive ball of fire, with the skeletal wreckage flying up and flipping through the air. The remaining cartel members were tossed up and away, many lit ablaze and screaming with the conflagration that would not be doused by a simple stop, drop, and roll. Sam and Joe stood slowly, stalking around the bullet-ridden vehicle that served as their temporary hiding place. They moved toward the burning wreckage that was once a van, as it fell on a few unlucky cartel members, squashing them like ants into the pavement. A few of them emerged from the flames who had not been caught ablaze. However, they were badly hurt, with burns splotched all over their bodies. Sam stole a glance back over toward the fallen body of his friend and the officers who had followed him. He then slowly looked back at the still living members of the cartel, who writhed in agony. He quickly drew a handgun from his belt and approached, firing off at point-blank range, killing each with a single shot to the side of the head. He was merciless in his execution, and he could sense Joe behind him, watching him with curiosity. Sam turned around, limping slightly on his injured leg as the wounded muscles cramped up. "All set here," Sam said to Joe, who grimly nodded in understanding. Joe wasn't the touchy-feely type. He wasn't going to sit here and ask Sam how he was feeling or insist that he process his emotions before moving out. Joe knew if Sam needed to talk, he'd talk. Sam was grateful for Joe's understanding at that moment. The last thing he needed was some long, drawn-out conversation about loss or what his friendship with Charlie had meant to his life. The less said about it, the better. "We missed one," Joe said, pointing with his chin off in the distance. Sam turned to see a cartel member limping as he ran from the battlefield. He was already too far to pursue, especially with Sam's knee locking up. "Let him go," Sam said, looking back at the rapidly expanding pool of blood surrounding his friend. "We've done enough." "So what's next?" Joe asked, not giving Sam even a moment to dwell on the finality of the last few moments. "You want to head to the precinct? Try to get more cops on our side so we can push these fuckers back?" Sam thought about it for a long moment, a tear forming in his left eye as he remembered the first day Charlie had arrived in his precinct. At the time, he'd been a young rookie, ready to take on the world. He was excited to learn from a veteran officer like Sam. Charlie had always been respectful and deferential to Sam's leadership, but he'd had the natural charisma and leadership ability to know when to offer his own insight. He'd been the perfect protege, and Sam cursed the fact that they'd fallen out of touch these last several years. He slammed his eyelids down, trapping the tear against his iris, not willing to let it spill here in this God-forsaken place. "No," Sam said, his vision still enshrouded in the internal night that rested behind his eyelids. We're not putting anyone else in danger over this. He opened his eyes once more, a hazy blur forming over the vision in his left eye, as the tear splotched unshed. He didn't reach up to wipe at it, not wanting Joe to see that moment of weakness. The new plan is the old plan, Sam continued. We go in quietly, we get my family, and we get the fuck out of here. Roger, Joe replied, clapping a hand on his shoulder once more and giving a reassuring squeeze. That was the only condolence Sam would receive from his oldest friend, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 8. Hanging lanterns lit the interior of the former chop shop, where Julio Roja ruled over his soldiers. Anyone who walked into that space would describe it exactly in that way. He sat at the far end of the shop, lounging on a huge, padded, tall-backed chair that resembled a throne. He leaned back, with one leg propped up on an armrest and an empty shot glass in one hand that he passed from finger to finger. "Where the fuck is Emilio?" he called out in Spanish to his soldiers, who bustled about the converted space. Over the last 24 hours, this former auto shop had been transformed into an audience chamber, an armory, for the man who now considered himself the sovereign of New York City. "Still not back yet, Jefe," his top lieutenant Juan called out as he approached the side of the chair. Julio turned his cold eye toward Juan, staring through him with white-hot intensity that flashed into a person's soul like a knife. Juan had worked under Julio since their early days, coming up in the business together under Julio's uncle, Don Eduardo. They grew up together, and Juan was the closest thing Julio had to a friend. But he was certain that even Juan knew that one wrong word, one moment of disrespect, would be all the cartel drug lord needed to viciously beat him to death. Julio brought up his free hand and adjusted the black patch that sat over the remnant of his left eye. He said nothing as he continued to stare at Juan until all of the surrounding bustle of his soldiers seemed to vanish. This was something he often did when dealing with his subordinates. He found that by focusing on them intently, he accomplished a great many things. For starters, he made them extremely uncomfortable. When liars were uncomfortable, they often say or do something to give themselves up. Additionally, it gave him time to study them, learn their tics and movements, and determine when they were acting out of character. When he focused so intently on a person to the point where all ambient noise would vanish, he felt connected to them, as though there were no thought, no action, no occurrence that they could hide from his all-seeing eye. Content that Juan was hiding nothing, Julio's lips split into a grin, showing off the metallic grill that covered his teeth. "That piece of shit probably got lost with his GPS," he spat, holding out his shot glass expectantly. A scantily clad, curvaceous woman ran forward with a bottle of tequila, filling the tiny glass and then stepping back. Julio turned his head to watch her hips sway as she sauntered back to her place behind his chair. "That's true, Jefe," Juan replied with a smile of his own. Julio brought the shot glass to his lips and downed it in one gulp. He swallowed the powerful alcohol while keeping his face completely still, with no change in expression whatsoever. This was yet another tactic he employed to show those who followed him that he was above simple human reactions. The burning of the alcohol had no power over him. He had all of the power over everyone and everything within his orbit. Soon, that orbit would get a lot bigger. "I want those fucking cockroach policia out of my territory," he said. "I want them all gunned down like dogs in the street." "I know, Jefe," Juan said, and Julio suddenly sat bolt upright in his chair. "What the fuck did you just say to me?" he asked, his single eye narrowing in, a quiet, smoldering fury. Juan instantly realized that he'd made a potentially fatal error and started to tremble, his eyes doubling in size as the enormity of the moment settled on top of him with the weight of an African elephant. "I was just agreeing with you," he stammered. Beads of sweat started to form on his forehead, which had nothing to do with the humidity within the space. "But that's not what you said," Julio growled. "You said, you know. Are you getting impatient with me, Juan?" "No, of course not," he said, holding up his hands to halt his boss's train of thought. "Do I annoy you?" Julio asked, his voice lowering even more to a very dangerous place. All ambient noise was silenced once more, but that had nothing to do with Julio's concentration. All work within the space had stopped, and every eye in the building was now trained on this encounter. Of course not, man," Juan said, taking a small step back in spite of himself. It did not go unnoticed. "You gonna run from me now?" he asked, looking down at Juan's shaking legs. "No," Juan insisted, shaking his head from side to side, his eyes now pleading for any way out of this horrifying situation. Julio took a step toward him. "People who run got something to hide," Julio said. He noticed Juan's legs twitching at his approach, but he stayed rooted in place. He respected that. "What are you hiding, amigo?" He spat the last word ironically. "Nothing, man." His jaw now quaking in a blind panic. "Seriously, nothing." Julio looked at him for a long, hard minute, allowing the seconds to stretch into eternity, until the beating of Juan's frenzied heart could practically be heard outside his chest. Then his face slowly broke into a grin, showing off the gleaming shine of his grill as he laughed loudly in his friend's face. "Man, you should have seen your face," he exclaimed, reaching out to smack Juan lightly against the chest. Juan exhaled deeply, and a nervous smile came over his terrified features. He gave a small laugh as the entire room erupted into self-serving laughter at their leader's twisted sense of humor. "You were so fucking scared, amigo," Julio exclaimed, taking a few steps away and throwing his arms in the air as he belly laughed. "You thought I was going to do this." The smile instantly vanished from his lips, his laughter a far distant memory, as in the span of a single heartbeat, his face twisted in unconditional rage. Before Juan had a chance to respond, Julio cleared the space between them and slammed his fist, encrusted in jeweled golden rings, into the man's temple. Juan dropped like a stone, and all laughter in the room died. You could hear a pin drop for a single second before the booming sound of Julio's voice filled the area. "You stupid son of a whore!" he screamed as he slammed his fist into Juan's face once more, sending him sprawling onto the floor. "You want to disrespect me in my house? Is that what you want?" He kicked Juan in the ribs repeatedly, feeling them crack and splinter under the leather soles of his expensive shoes. It was a feeling Julio loved more than anything. It was like the sensation one got from stepping on a roach, but magnified on a much larger scale. It was a feeling of power that couldn't be bought. He continued the assault until Juan was coughing blood on the floor. "What?" Julio asked mockingly, tilting his head as he leaned over to look at his top lieutenant, writhing in agony. "You thought that because we played as kids that you could talk to me however you want? Is that what you thought?" Julio spat on Juan, the goopy saliva smacking him on the side of the head. "I spit on our friendship. I spit on your puta mama. I spit on your manhood." Julio wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. He leaped onto Juan, crouching over him and grabbing him by the front of his shirt. He slammed his fist into the man's face repeatedly, laughing and screaming as he did it. Facial bones gave way under the onslaught of his jeweled fingers, and he continued over and over again until Juan's body twitched in a furious spasm and then lay still. But even that didn't stop Julio. He continued to smash his fist into the man's face again and again until there was nothing left there that could still be considered a face. Finally, when he'd tired himself out, Julio fell back into a seated position and breathed deeply, catching his breath. With a groan, he climbed to his feet and looked out over the entirety of his workforce. They had stopped bustling about their individual tasks, sorting through rations and cataloging the weapons they'd taken from the bodies of dead cops and civilians. Their attentions were all fixated on Julio and on the still body of what had once been a living, breathing human being. This was good. They all had a look at the price of disrespect. They needed to fear Julio and respect him for more than just his title, more than just the family honor passed down to him through generational inheritance. They needed to fear his temper, his ferocity. They needed to understand that to fail him, to question him, to displease him in any way was a potential death sentence. This was more important now than ever before. Now, as the very nature of their business was shifting from the shadows into the light of day, as anarchy became the rule of law, he'd be able to bring this level of power and intimidation to the entire city, unopposed in his ultimate supremacy. "So much noise," a grizzled voice called out, echoing through the space and cutting through the uncomfortable silence. It was a voice Julio knew well, the voice that had guided his actions since he was a small child. It was so familiar to him that sometimes his own thoughts spoke in it. He turned around to see the hunched elderly figure of his uncle, Don Eduardo Roja, walk out from the back room. His alligator shoes clacked against the floor as he shuffled his way inside, the baggy gray pants swishing about his legs. He reached up to scratch his protruding belly, which sat beneath a salmon-colored collared polo shirt, which was maybe half a size too small. "Tio," Julio said, turning to walk up to the old man. He took him by the shoulders and kissed him on the top of his thinning, wispy white hair. "It's a good day today, is it?" the Don asked, with an irritated roll of his eyes. "I get waken up from my nap by the sound of your belly aching over something out here." "Sorry, Tio," Julio said, still feeling the eyes of every subordinate in the shop fixed on him. He didn't want them to bear witness to how his uncle spoke to him. It might lessen him in their eyes. He turned and glared at his men. "Get back to work, you lazy cockroaches, and someone cleans this up." He gestured at Juan's mutilated body, and two of his workers ran up to start dragging him away. "Was that Juan?" Don Eduardo asked, as the sound of work once more filled the surrounding area. "Sí, Tio," Julio replied, his eye narrowing in approval and disgust as the body was dragged away. "What did he do?" the Don's scratchy voice, made hoarse from years of cigar smoke, asked. "Disrespected me," Julio said, his voice dripping with contempt and disgust. "Ah, respect," Eduardo said, shuffling along the floor toward Julio's massive chair. "That's the most important thing when running this business. It always has been and always will be." The Don plopped himself down on the lush throne, and for a moment, Julio felt his stomach tighten at the action. But he couldn't bring himself to feel any anger toward Eduardo. This was the man who had raised him, taught him. and bestowed this leadership position on him in the first place. "I just want to be respected as you are, Tio," Julio said. The Don smiled in approval at him and nodded. "So that's why you're set yourself up here like a king," Eduardo said, patting the plush armrests of the makeshift throne. "I thought it was appropriate, Tio," Julio said, suddenly feeling very self-conscious in the face of his uncle's criticism. "They need to know my station." "Then you show them with action, Julito," the Don replied, looking at the chair he sat in with a grimace. "You want to be a king? Then you be a king. But any man who tells the world he's a king has no real power." Julio looked down and away, scanning the area as his cheeks turned red, making sure none of his subordinates were watching this exchange. His uncle had the uncanny ability to make him feel like a small child at any point in time, and Julio hated that. He longed for the day when he would fully have the old man's approval, when no more lessons would be necessary, and he could just run the business the way he wanted to. "You're always right, always, Tio," Julio said with a nod. "I'm just trying to take us in a whole new direction. The world is changing, and it's an exciting time for us." "Bah," the Don said, making a dismissive gesture with one liver-spotted hand. "I miss the TV." "Tio, what we're building is better and bigger than any TV show," Julio said, leaning down to look his uncle in the eye. "When I'm done, we're going to rule this city. You can have Central Park West elites acting out your soap operas for you." "We had enough power," the Don replied, pointing a crooked finger at his nephew. "You just see weakness and you want to exploit it." "What's wrong with that?" Julio asked with a laugh. "More power for us." "Picking on a weak enemy is easy," the Don said. "When you topple a strong enemy, then you have true power." "Well, there aren't a lot of enemies left," Julio said, his voice taking a defensive edge. "See," Eduardo said, "the last time you went after a strong enemy, you lost an eye." That statement superheated Julio's blood. For one shameful moment, his temper flared with such intensity that he actually had the desire to strike his uncle for such insolence. But that came and went in the blink of an eye. Don Eduardo loved to remind Julio of his greatest failure, the day he had Captain Sam Shields dead to rights and ended up losing an eye. "I shot him in the leg, if you remember," Julio said. "That ended the piece of shit's career. He never interfered with us again after I got through with him." Don Eduardo said. Julio understood that tone. The Don was dismissing Julio's statement, as though it had no bearing on the situation. I ended him, Tio," Julio insisted, his cheeks growing warm with frustration. "You ended his career," Eduardo said dryly. "You sent him off to a pension and a comfortable retirement to live out the rest of his days fat, happy and content with his family. That kind of statement doesn't strike fear into the hearts of our enemies, does it, nephew?" Julio was quiet for a long moment. He wanted to simply drop the subject, to move on to literally anything else. But his uncle's eyes remained locked on him expectantly. This was another power move Julio recognized from his youth. His uncle would ask an uncomfortable question, one whose answer was evident and embarrassing. But instead of letting it pass in silence, he'd stare at Julio until he admitted it out loud. "It doesn't, Tio," Julio said, his voice low and dejected. His fingers curled into fists as violent images of bloody ecstasy flashed through his mind's eye. This was not violence against his beloved uncle. The Don was simply pointing out the truth to him. And that was no great crime, at least not when it came from a member of his own family. Julio's rage was reserved in this case for one specific person. Shields had been a thorn in his side for a long time. He was an aggressive and worthy foe, one who deserved respect and admiration. But those feelings were difficult to come by whenever Julio ran his fingers over the black patch that covered the mutilated mess of his left eye. He thought of the former police captain several times a day, every day, and had since, long before the day he'd been stabbed in the eye. On that day, they'd fought man to man. It was the longest and hardest fight of Julio's life. Police captains were supposed to get fat sitting behind a desk, ordering younger and more capable officers out in the field to risk their lives. But not Shields. He led the attack on Julio's operation personally, and had thrown himself into the fray with the gusto of a rookie cop fresh out of the academy who was dying to get noticed by his superiors. After battling for what felt like an eternity, Julio had managed to score a shot to the captain's knee, taking out his leg completely and leaving him a screaming, bleeding mess on the floor. He thought about that moment often. It was the most satisfying moment of his life for a brief instant. One more shot to the chest or head, and Sam Shields would have finally been in the ground. But Julio had been arrogant. He wanted to get in close and finish this personally. He'd grabbed Shields from behind, attempting to choke him out with his rifle, taunting him all the while. But while Shields may have been down, he wasn't out. He grabbed a large piece of broken glass from a window that had been shattered in their fight and drove the jagged edge through Julio's eye. The burning, white-hot intensity of that pain had been all-consuming, as was his rage as he rolled half-blind along the floor, desperately clutching his face. He'd been lucky that Shields hadn't finished him off then and there. He'd been losing a lot of blood and likely decided that escape was the better option. That was the last time the two foes had laid eyes on one another, and Julio always longed for the day when he could finish the job he'd started on that pig's leg. But after Shields retired, he had all but vanished. His whereabouts were protected as he retreated fully from the public eye. Try as he might, Julio was never able to find him. But now, with the world changing and the city up for grabs, he'd finally started to let go of this long-held grudge. There were larger stakes here than Sam Fields, and he'd be able to impose his will fully upon the city that his nemesis once had dedicated his life to. That would be true justice and revenge. He only hoped that somewhere out there, Shields was still alive and would hear about his ultimate victory. "Bah," the Don said, making a dismissive gesture with his hand, as if to say that this conversation was beneath him. Julio hated these moments of disapproval. They made him feel 2 feet tall in the shadow of this man's mountainous presence. His attention was drawn away from his uncle as the door to the chop shop opened. He looked over to see 2 of his men carrying someone inside. They laid the man on the floor, and Julio instantly recognized him as one of Emilio's crew. "What the fuck?" he called out, drawing the attention of his men as he stalked down into their midst. The soldiers scattered at his approach, as though he were a great white shark swimming into a school of fish. Julio approached the man and looked down at him. He was bleeding, and his clothing was torn. Red and black burns covered parts of his body. "Who did this?" Julio demanded, not concerned in the least about the severity of these injuries. "Policia?" "No," the man breathed, coughing blood onto the floor near Julio's shoes. "We found a platoon of policia in the neighborhood. We listened in on them and then attacked. We killed Lieutenant Charlie Arthur and all his men." "Well, hey, that's some good news," Julio exclaimed, and the men around him cheered briefly, before falling silent again to listen to whatever else this man had to say. "So where's Emilio? Where's the rest of your crew?" "Dead," he said. "All dead." The celebratory atmosphere instantly died. "What do you mean dead?" Julio asked, a dangerous edge to his tone. "Did those pigs kill them?" "No," the man wheezed, as he spat a fresh trail of blood onto the floor. "There were 2 others with them. Not cops, fought like demons, blew up a truck to get at us." "Who?" Julio asked intently, squatting down to get close to the man's face as he glared at him with his one good eye. "Who the fuck dared raise their hand to my men?" "Arthur called him Cap," the man said. And Julio suddenly tensed. "Cap?" he asked, suddenly very interested. "What do you mean, Cap?" "That was what he called the one," the wounded man coughed. "They seemed like they were old friends." Julio stood up and looked up at his uncle, who was sitting up and forward in the chair, listening intently. "He walked," the man said, gasping for breath. "Walked with a limp." Julio took a sharp step back and turned again to look at the Don, whose face was scrunched into a wicked smirk. There was only one person who Charlie Arthur would call Cap, and if he was walking with a pronounced limp, that could only mean one thing. Julio dashed back to the wounded soldier's side, crouched down, and grabbed the man by the shirt, pulling him up at an angle and bringing his face down close. "Tell me everything," he snarled.